Hi, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces and a lot of new ones. I was asked to talk a little bit about a piece of legislation that is really moving its way through the legislative process, Senate Bill 4, which a lot of you might know as the Anti-Sanctuary Cities Bill. That's what the governor, who has made it his emergency priority item, has termed it. When we think of sanctuary cities, we actually call them community trust cities because what the bill actually targets are policies that local law enforcement has set that help build community trust with their community members, specifically by not asking the immigration status of people that are during the process of an investigation. And so this bill, Senate Bill 4, by Senator Charles Perry, and in the House by Representative Charlie Guerin, has moved through the process. It's passed the full House. Last week, it passed the House State Affairs Committee. And so it is now headed soon to the House Calendars Committee. And eventually, if it passes out of that committee and gets set for calendars, it will be heard on the House floor. After that, if it passes the full House, it will likely get set for what's called a conference committee, where the House and the Senate work out their differences. So today, just for folks who don't know too much about the bill, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the bill does, what some of the changes have been from the Senate to the House side, and how everybody can get involved, starting today. So first, a little bit about what Senate Bill 4 does. Senate Bill 4, as I mentioned, it would overturn local policies currently in cities like Austin and San Antonio, and all over the state, really, in most urban localities where the local chiefs of police have decided not to ask immigration status, and also sheriffs as well. I know in San Antonio, where I'm from, local police have worked really hard over the last decade and more to create community relationships, build relationships with people, so that no matter if you're undocumented or documented or from a mixed status family, you feel secure in reporting crime to the police. And I know this is something that has been a big problem. Before I joined MALDEF, as an attorney at MALDEF, I used to take some cases related to helping women, undocumented women who were survivors of domestic violence, get legal status based on their situation and having been survivors. And often they would tell me that their U.S. citizen husbands would tell them, if you call the police on me, I will have you deported. The police will deport you. They will ask about your immigration status, and you will be separated from your children. And so there's this culture of fear that already exists, that has existed for many, many years. And just the existence of Senate Bill 4 has increased some of that fear. It hasn't even passed. But just to give you a sense, the rate of Latinas in Houston, as was reported recently by the Houston Police Chief, Art Acevedo, he said the rate of Latinas reporting rapes in the Houston area has gone down by over 40% just in the last year. And all of violent crime reporting has dropped about 13%. This is just for having a piece of legislation coupled, of course, with the actions of the Trump administration. And so let's talk a little bit about how the Trump administration, what they have to do with Senate Bill 4. Senate Bill 4 would bind local officials in Texas, cities, and law enforcement executives to the administration by requiring cooperation. And what that means, that looks like different things, right? I think what we at MALDEF and many of our allies are most concerned about is not necessarily what's been the highlight of the news, right? In the news, the governor who has the bully pulpit has really talked a lot about, in Austin, a Travis County sheriff defying his authority. And it's really been about a local official versus the governor. We're really actually concerned more about what is happening on the ground and how it impacts everyday people in daily interactions with law enforcement. And what happens is now under the Trump administration, and I have a handout that I'll pass out, and I'm happy to send it to you for folks online. But there was one of the infamous executive orders in January was the January 25th Trump administration executive order, which really changed how the administration would go after and seek to deport people who are here without papers. And whereas under the previous administration, there was a policy, at least a stated policy, to go after folks with serious criminal records. That's kind of been undone through the January 25th executive order, and now we call it. We don't really say priorities anymore. It's really non-priority enforcement. Why? Because under the new executive order, somebody who is undocumented, who has been convicted of a crime, any crime, Class C misdemeanor traffic ticket, any crime, has been charged with a crime, not even convicted, has committed acts that amount to a chargeable offense, not even charged, has somehow engaged in willful misrepresentation of their identity, something that's, that happens in the undocumented community, and somebody who's abused a public benefit program, whatever that means. All of these people now are enforcement priorities of the Trump administration. And SB 4 here in Texas would bind local officials to cooperate with federalized authorities in their new enforcement priorities. And so not only would SB 4 bind local officials for what the Trump administration is doing today, but also tomorrow and the next day, which we don't yet know about, right? And I know for those who have seen some of the enforcement actions and how they have gone about, particularly enforcement actions at domestic violence courts, that's very troubling, particularly on the ground enforcement when you're talking about just getting stopped at a traffic light for not, signaling or for speeding, for not having, for driving without a license, which currently in Texas, if you're undocumented, you don't have access to a Texas driver's license. Any of these things now put you at risk. And so we're very concerned about what that means for families, what that means for family separation and deportation. You heard hundreds of people come and testify before the Senate and before the House. Over 1,000 people registered in each hearing against the bill. I would say less than a dozen people for the bill, and yet this bill is moving quickly through the process. And that's something that why we need your help so urgently, because I think that it's one thing for the immigrant community and their advocates to call on local officials and call on their state representatives to do something, but I think you all have a special place, a special role in legislative advocacy, and so we are calling and asking for your urgent help. What is one thing that you can do? Call right now. The bill, as I mentioned, is in the House Calendars Committee, and the chairman of that committee is Chairman Todd Hunter, who has the power whether or not to set the bill to be heard on the House floor. Now, realistically, this bill is likely to pass through the House Calendars Committee, but what we would ask is the request, right? The ask of the chairman is to not set it for calendar, but if he is, to delay it, because in the legislature, it is harder to pass a bill than it is to kill it. Even a bill as a priority item of the governor, and so every day of delay matters. So that's the first ask. For those of you from Austin, I would safely assume that most of your representatives have probably spoken out against SB 4. But for all of those of you online from across the state, we encourage everyone to call their representative, because should this bill go to the House floor, we will need every vote, particularly those of more moderate Republicans. I think that for the most part, we understand that at least in the Democratic Party, they're fairly united against this bill. And I think that there are some folks in the other party, in the leadership party, that aren't crazy about the bill in its current form, but are facing immense pressure and really need political cover from people like you to make those phone calls and speak out. Just a little bit more about why we oppose Senate Bill 4. In addition to what it does for community safety, making people less likely to call the police and tying local law enforcement's hands by saying you can no longer set your own local law enforcement priorities. There's also constitutional issues. And so for MALDEF, a law firm, a nonprofit civil rights organization, we're concerned about some of the constitutional issues, particularly just basic Fourth Amendment rights, right? If you cannot be held by the government unreasonably, and what happens under SB 4 is that any local discretion not to comply with what we call voluntary requests from ICE immigration officials would be illegal, and it would lead to the criminalization of local police chiefs and sheriffs. So, for example, in Illinois, in the state of Illinois last week, MALDEF filed a lawsuit because a Honduran man, our client, a father of 3, who is a cook and a factory worker, he was charged and ordered released by a judge on bond. However, because that county, that particular sheriff in Illinois, said that he was going to comply with all ICE detainer requests, which are voluntary, he said, I'm going to comply with this request, and illegally held this man beyond what he had authority to do. And what's going to happen is that that's going to happen in Texas when you require 100% compliance. And when you do that, people's constitutional rights are going to be violated, and it's going to lead to taxpayer dollars going to defend lawsuits where people are asserting their constitutional rights. Just another point is, we saw in Arizona what happened after SB 1070. We saw in Georgia after the anti-immigrant laws were passed there. Farmland and vegetation just deserted and rotting because of the impact on the economy. We don't want Texas to be known as an unwelcome state for the immigrant community. Already we're seeing predictions of losses in the billions for this if this bill were to become law. And so for all of these reasons, but particularly because of what will happen to families in the community that are going to be impacted, whose voices have not been lifted up, but we encourage you to help lift them up in your phone calls. We really just want to urge your participation, and I'm happy to take questions, I guess, right now or later?
Do it now. If you don't do it now.
Okay.
Any questions for Celina?
Do you have an idea of the House changes to Senate Bill 4?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that question. So there are some things that are better, and there's some things that are worse. So I'll start with the bad news first. When the bill passed the Senate, the bill had taken out, or at some form in the Senate, the bill had taken out campuses. I think when it passed committee, but that has been put back in, and that includes both private ecumenical universities and also public universities. And so I think that that's something that is just really concerning for Dreamer students. Just for people, this is something that will require cooperation with ICE and local campus police. And this is not something that just impacts the undocumented immigrant community. This impacts the racial profiling that is likely to occur, impacts anybody who looks like an immigrant. And what does that mean? That has largely meant anybody who's brown, anybody who's Latino, getting stopped and harassed. And that has happened in other localities where provisions like this have taken place. On the positive side, the House version now, as it's passed through the State Affairs Committee, no longer has the provision that where it says that police can ask immigration status of somebody who has been lawfully detained. Now it requires an arrest to happen. And why that's important, so lawfully detained can just be a police officer going to somebody on the street, stopping and frisking them. It can be if you get stopped for speeding and I'm a police officer and I stop you, I have just lawfully detained you. You are not free to go until I say you're free to go. And so you can imagine the fear that instilled when any traffic stop could now be a place where you can be asked about your immigration status. However, I think that many of the concerns and the fears are still warranted even with the current versions, because what happens now is even though you can't do that on a lawful detention, you can still do that on an arrest. And here's what has happened in cities that have had similar changes in their laws or ordinances that with similar changes. So for example, in Irving, when there were some changes in the city of Irving, when there were some changes in their laws, you saw more arrests. So we've heard of driving while black and driving while brown, and pretextual stops by police. There are also such thing as pretextual arrests. So arresting somebody on a low-level offense, you can arrest somebody on an offense as low as a Class C misdemeanor in order to ask the questions that you are seeking to ask. And so what happened in Irving, Texas, you saw more Latino residents being arrested for very low-level offenses. And so you can see how that would, again, happen under SB 4. We have also seen in other localities is prolonged detention. So, okay, I'm not going to arrest you, but I'm going to talk with ICE and wait for ICE to come and meet me here by the side of the road to come question you about your immigration status. I'm going to hold you longer. And that leads to some constitutional issues as well. But those are also likely very foreseeable consequences. Racial profiling is a foreseeable consequence of SB 4, even though there's language in there that specifically says racial profiling is prohibited. I think, and this is not MALDEF, Celina, a civil rights attorney saying this. This is sheriff and after sheriff, police chief after police chief coming before the legislature, begging them not to pass this law because this is a very foreseeable consequence, and it will undo the hard work that they have done in their community to try to build those relationships. And so you've had law enforcement, you've had businesses come forward, you've had faith leaders come forward, and you've had the advocacy community come forward. And so what do we have to do to delay and stop this bill? We have to go full force and do even more than we've been doing. And so again, I just ask for your urgent help on that, and happy to answer. Did I answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Yeah. My impression has been that sheriffs are more likely to support this bill than police chiefs. And I was wondering why.
That's an interesting observation. So I will say that the Sheriff's Association is one of the very few organizations that did support SB 4. Let me put that into context. The current head of the Sheriff's Association, the lobbyist, is from a rural area, Sheriff Lauterbach. If you were to ask the localities, the sheriffs of the major cities in Texas where the vast majority of Texans live, the vast majority of people of color live, the vast majority of immigrants live, they have all come forward against this bill. And so it is true that you have a head of the Sheriff's Association that has come forward for that association. But my guess is that if there was an urban sheriff's association, and I'm not even sure that he speaks for all rural sheriffs, but let's say, even assuming that, which I don't think that's a fair assumption, you would see very different responses. And you have. It's a keen observation.
So again, you had said there was it about 600 people came forward and spoke against the bill and less than a dozen for it. And it just gives us the feeling that, I mean, calling I know is helpful sometimes, but it gives us the feeling that they're not paying any attention to it.
Well, I think that the changes that have been made in the House version, because I do think the House is a different animal than the Senate. I do think that there is a lot more discomfort with the current language in the House than there was in the Senate, and that's why you saw it just fly out of the Senate.
Right.
It was heard very early in the legislative session before almost any bill was being heard. There's definitely been delay in the House. And I think one thing that's telling that I think that still gives us some hope for, if not stopping the bill, substantially improving it for on-the-ground enforcement, is Chairman Cook's own words. Chairman Byron Cook, the chairman of the House State Affairs Committee, said publicly, and it's reported in the press, that he thinks that this bill really should just be about the detention process, right? So once somebody's already been arrested and booked and is in jail, not at your on-the-ground enforcement, daily interaction with law enforcement, with the community, but over here, this bill should really be narrowed to that. The bill has not yet reached that point, and I think that it is up to us to push and push and push until it does. I do think that, to your point, it is going to be very difficult to stop altogether. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's very unlikely. But I do think that there's hope to make this bill better, and what it will take is for all of us to call specifically on those on-the-ground enforcement provisions.
And the House will have a hearing too.
The House has already had a hearing, and they've already passed it out of the State Affairs Committee, but there are still steps left in the process. Now, the other reason to make phone calls is not just to stop the bill; it's to keep it from making it worse, and that's depressing news. But we have to just be real. The House is a free-for-all. Once it hits the House floor, what has been a more measured State Affairs Committee and a chairman that has made comments like the one I just mentioned, no longer has control over this bill. The Speaker of the House to some extent does, and he's been fairly measured over the bill as well, but also kind of letting the House do what it will do. And so the House, you can definitely see, just from what you saw a couple of weeks ago during the House budget debate, when you had bills that haven't even gotten hearings, like a repeal to end the Texas DREAM Act. You saw amendments that would do the same thing. We are likely to see amendments that would do things like that, right? That would make the bill worse, that would take it back, make it more strict, and be more punitive. And so, for example, right now, the bill excludes churches. It excludes K through 12 campuses, excludes hospital districts, local police that are working with hospital districts. There's exclusions in the bill right now that could go away that are very important, particularly to the faith community. And so those are also reasons to call and express opposition to the bill.
It excludes campuses, did you say?
Right now, it includes local campus police in both private and public campuses.
But it excludes
K through
churches and
K
hospitals?
through 12 campuses, so elementary, middle, and high schools, and hospitals. Do you want to add anything?
No, I haven't read. Did you see I haven't seen the version that passed out. Does it still include like our church, whenever we hire off-duty officers?
Yes.
Okay, so they can still be required as a duty to.
Yeah.
All right. One more question for Celina.
I didn't catch the House bill number. You talked about Senate Bill 4, but what's
So,
the House Bill? number?
So the House bill the House bill was never heard. The House ended up hearing Senate Bill 4 once it came
Oh,
over.
I see.
And so
Okay.
it still remains Senate Bill 4.
Okay,